Hello. Hello. Welcome to today's broadcast. Thanks for joining in. I'm going to be talking about some things that have happened today because a lot's happened. Fairly notoriously, Trump has fired some people, terminated them, as he likes to say, and two very racist and now very famous Republican officials initially refused to certify the results in Michigan. And then, in Wayne County, Michigan. And then after a few hours of public uproar, hello, Marsha, hello, Craig, hello, Fossil Hunter. After a couple of hours of public uproar and maybe some people reminding them about the legality surrounding this issue, those two Republican officials then changed their minds, and so certifying the election results became a consensus decision. Yes, I will validate your feelings. It's perfectly valid to be afraid and to be concerned about how much Trump can screw up before he's dragged away. Of course, he's been screwing things up terribly for 4 years, and there's a very large body count to back up that assertion. This is Ned Stabler, who's a Wayne County board member of Canvassers. So he is here chastising William Hartman and Monica Palmer, the two Republican officials who refused to certify the ballots for Wayne County. So everybody's celebrating Ned's actions today in calling out racism as racism, which is so important. It's part of the uncomfortable conversations that we need to get comfortable having if we're going to keep working our way through this current historical moment of a lurch towards fascism on some part of the population. Hello, Alan. And yes, troop drawdown in various areas, sort of, maybe last minute favors for Putin out the door, but again, very geopolitically destabilizing for America, not to mention destabilizing for geopolitical goals and for nations.
Know that the Secretary of State and the Attorney General have already tweeted out that your legal arguments are rubbish and you're going to lose when it comes to court. So we're not worried about that at all. I'm also not worried about any of your, things are bad so we can't certify arguments, because that's just ridiculous. You certified in August when they were worse. Less than 50% of the ballots are recountable. Now over 72% are. 58% of them are even balanced when it was less than 30% last time. So it's doubled. It's gotten way better because the Secretary of State actually jumped in and did her job, unlike you. But I know it's not going to change your opinion. You talked about not certifying Detroit, even though you acknowledged that Livonia, a city, by the way, I know is 95% white, had bigger variances than Detroit, which is 80% black. We understand, and you now added your name. So I'm not going to try to change your mind. I just want to let you know that the Trump stink, the stain of racism that you, William Hartman, and Monica Palmer have just covered yourself in, is going to follow you throughout history. Your grandchildren are going to think of you like Bull Connor or George Wallace. Monica Palmer and William Hartman will forever be known in southeastern Michigan as two racists who did something so unprecedented that they disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of black voters in the city of Detroit because they were ordered to. Probably, I know, Monica, you think Q told you to do it or some other crazy stuff like that. But just know, when you try to sleep tonight, that millions of people around the world now on Twitter know the name Monica Palmer and William Hartman as two people completely racist and without an understanding of what integrity means or a shred of human decency. The law isn't on your side, history won't be on your side, your conscience will not be on your side, and Lord knows, when you go to meet your maker, your soul is going to be very, very warm.
Thank you.
There's Monica Palmer. Oh my gosh, look at her eyebrows. They are raised so high. That's William Hartman over to the left. His Facebook account shows a lot of extremely racist memes characterizing Obama as a cigar smoking criminal, just very a very racist shaped worldview, showing how racism is a force to pull people away from rationality and the ability to engage with evidence. So William Hartman's someone who found it difficult to believe that Obama had helped lead the American economy on a recovery trajectory. So yes, I'm presuming we've muted that troll by now. He said, Ned is terrible, but not as bad as Dav. She is the worst person in the world. Do you need a little bit of copium today, Bill? Are you just trying to make yourself feel better because it's hard to process that America managed to defeat fascism at the election booth? I know, some people act out when they feel bad. And as a mother of 2 beautiful children, I'm learning to train my instincts to respond to terrible behavior sometimes with love. With love. So Bill Tetley 16, I hope you get the love you need to transmute your soul into a place that's a little bit healthier and a little bit better adjusted in terms of coping with reality. I mean, we're all at risk of the acting out tendencies of large adult children who have problems with processing information right now, because there's been such a concerted movement to deceive Americans and indeed people around the world. There's a lot of concerted, hyper-motivated, vested interests putting money towards and energy and time towards generating conspiracy theories and circulating disinformation that really perverts people's thinking and really sends their emotions off the beaten track of decency. What is this taunting? This is childish. Are you talking about this taunting where someone said that Ned is terrible but not as bad as Dav? She is the worst person in the world. Are you calling me childish for responding to that? That's kind of cute, I guess. Kind of cute. That is towards me. Well, bless your heart. Bless your heart. I dignify you with more attention, but then at the same time, I don't think it would be good for you. And you know, you might find this a little bit patronizing, but I want you to find things that are good for you, because that's not just good for you, that's good for the world. Drug addiction is often described to be a product of social isolation, but so is pathological behavior. So is Machiavellian narcissism and all of those psychopathologies. They're often a product of people feeling isolated and not loved enough and unable to engage with people in a meaningful and appropriate way. So I wish all the good things for you. We are all Antifa. Well, you know what? Antifa is anti-fascist. It's not really an organization so much as a position. And I'll grant you that there's some probably fairly unwashed activists on the far left who you probably wouldn't get along with, and I probably wouldn't get along with either. So we can start from that point of commonality, but beyond that, I'm imagining that you're probably a bit of a fascist yourself, and that's where we'd probably stop getting along and stop being in agreement with each other. But yes, we are all connected. Thank you, Critter 1667. So yes, so I just kept that big picture up. I'll make it bigger even for 1 minute just to look at Monica's eyebrows, because I do think that's captured a very special moment in American history of a white man really standing up for people of color, Black people in America, who have been under attack by the Republican Party, who have sought to disenfranchise and disempower people of color, Black Americans, by making it more difficult for people in predominantly Black communities to vote, making access to voting booths more difficult, making lines longer, making people jump through more hoops, and then finally just outwardly, openly refusing to certify election results. I'll certify them from other counties, other areas, but not from Detroit, because Detroit was just apparently, even though it had a lower rate of discrepancies than a predominantly white area, And when they say discrepancies, we're not talking anything particularly dodgy, just the numbers not entirely matching up. So, yes. Oh my gosh, look at this troll. How have they been attacked? What is your source? Your source, quote your source. They didn't allow observers in. Wow, I would just have to move beyond addressing that troll. They've gone cray-cray. Take your meds, which is a rude thing to say. And I retract it and I apologize for it. One shouldn't use mental health slurs against people. Shouldn't do it. But it's definitely a fabrication that observers weren't allowed in. And if you increase your media diet, so it includes more nutrients in terms of fats, you'll find out that observers were definitely allowed in, and that's why 24 cases have been tossed out of court by judges when Trump lawyers have endeavored to make that specious argument in court. But of course, they're not necessarily even making those arguments in court to win. They're making it to incite poor dupes like that person commenting to donate more money to the Trump campaign to help them pay off their debts from their campaign and to fund the RNC. And yep, that's what is the problem with those people. Now I've got, yes, it was very, very publicly racist, and a lot of the last 4 years have been very damaging for America. But one gain is that we've all had much more opportunity to observe racism. Yes. Thank you. All right, the thing I've making larger here is heartbreaking tweets from Nebraska's COVID-19 frontlines. So there's a PhD professor Professor Lau, John J. Lau, who says, we keep using data to communicate COVID risks, trends, and to ask people to take precautions. As the US peaks, perhaps it is time to share our personal experiences. So to my fellow COVID warriors, what experiences left an imprint on you? Now, as someone interested in communication and the power of communication to affect real world change, which includes political change, but yes, real world change, changing real world behaviors, as well as inspiring leaders to do the right thing as well. These are some of the responses to his tweet. I think it's so important to make these things human. People switch off from graphs and the numbers themselves become dehumanizing. So Kelly Corcutt, MD, MS, infectious diseases expert, critical care physician at Nebraska Medical Center, writes, let's see, what does she write? Holding the hand of my sweet patient when she asked if she was going to die and having to say, yes, I believe you will. Or calling yet another family to say, I've done everything I can. I've used all the life support measures I have, but your loved one is dying. Would you like to come finally visit? Or coming home and breaking down in tears because so many patients have died and the burden is so hard to carry for all of us. And then we see inadequate action to stop the growing weight of lives lost. Omri David Soffer, neonatologist at Children's Hospital and Medical Center and Nebraska Medical Center, telling a mum who was intubated and sedated for weeks because of COVID that we had to deliver her extremely premature baby and that he didn't make it. That's a hard one, yes. Dustin Krutzinger, MD, pulmonologist at Nebraska Medical Center, taking care of a young lady with Down syndrome who is on the ventilator. I picture my sister, who is the same age and also has Downs. Alison Laflamme, MD, hospitalist at Methodist Fremont Health. Over and over, going into my patient's room in my spacesuit-looking attire and telling them they're worsening, they're not keeping their oxygen sats up with maximum support, and that we're probably going to have to intubate, and to call their family and act as if it is the last time they will ever talk. Sean Thompson, MD, critical care anesthesiologist at Nebraska Medical Center. Being our ECMO director, every time I have to say no to using this therapy as patient is too far gone really wears on me too. It has been a huge emotional toll. Sean Thompson, having to call a loved one to inform them that their mother died, only to learn that they were bringing their father into the ED because of COVID and needing ICU care. Anne Anderson Berry, MD, PhD, neonatologist at Children's Hospital and Medical Center and Nebraska Medical Center, taking an ill newborn from their COVID-positive parents' arms to be admitted to ICU while they were home alone without baby. It was heartbreaking. Alice Sato, MD, PhD, infectious diseases expert at Children's Hospital and Medical Center and Nebraska Medical Center. Last spring, caring for a kid with a new complication, miscellaneous COVID symptoms of a new disease, go from outpatient phone call to admission to ICU in hours, knowing no one in the world was really an expert in this disease or how best to treat it. Natalie Lynch said, mid-April, I sat with the daughter of my hospital's first impending COVID death as he transitioned to CMO. I don't know what CMO is, but I'm presuming low oxygen. I had beads of sweat from my protective equipment mixed with tears running down my face. My grief for them rivaled my anxiety about going home to my immunocompromised husband after work. Mandy Byers, MD, geriatrician at Nebraska Medical Center. Calls with scared spouses and adult children who haven't been able to hug loved ones in months. Exhausted eyes of staff who don protective equipment all day, every day. And the voice on the phone when a nurse calls to tell me a resident is dyspneic. Oh, I'm imagining that's also low oxygen. I don't know. Is dyspneic or has tested positive. Nursing home residents are not just patients to us. They are beloved members of our community. They are often with us for several years before passing on. A COVID outbreak takes people from us so fast there is no time to mourn. Alison During Anderson, PharmD, clinical associate professor at UNMC. For me, the shock was how hard it is to cry while wearing a mask. You can't blow your nose. Oh, she says, I'm not a warrior, but I'm cheering for you who are. Kylie Gunier, registered nurse at Nebraska Medical Center. COVID positive patient in ICU, elderly man in his 80s, still in his right mind. He's maxed on BiPAP support and begging me all shift just to let him go, but me asking him over and over to hold on for just one more family member to say goodbye. So he did. It's tough to see, Dr. Angela Hewlett says, it's tough to see all of the hospitalized patient stories, like a patient who lost both parents to COVID within a few days, or a grandparent becoming infected and critically ill after attending a small family dinner with her grandkids. There are no words for how terrible this is. In March, I received a call from an infectious disease physician in New York City. He needed an ear. He cried. He described patients dying in ambulances outside the hospital, entire floors dedicated to COVID, and colleagues who had been intubated. We are almost there in the Midwest. I have a few in August myself. An operating room nurse, an ICU nurse, and I went to a nursing home with active outbreaks and deaths. When we entered the hot zone, the staff froze in terror, then wept when they realized we were there to help. They had been working alone their entire shift. How you can help these heroes: stay home as much as possible, wear a mask anytime you're out in public, cancel planned activities and events with people outside your hospital if possible. Yes, even youth sports, and yes, even Thanksgiving. Avoid bars and restaurants. Support local business by getting takeout instead. Wash your hands like you did back in March. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Give a little extra grace to anyone who needs it. So it is very humanizing, isn't it? Matthew Pudicombe says, I've seen screen captures from Parler, and a lot of these people are not being duped. They know they are lying, but they can't defend their positions if they had to say their real opinion. There's probably a bit of both, isn't there? It's hard for you to breathe listening to that. It's hard, isn't it? Your daughter has dreams. She's playing with her friends and then cries when she wakes up and realizes she won't see them. Yes, it is hard, isn't it? My children, I'm not in America, so I'm in a country that has contained COVID. And my children have been able to be back at school now for months, and I'm so sorry for America having such terrible leadership. And it must be hard as well to be the objects of pity from around the world. But worse still is to know that there's so many people who don't understand why America is in a pitiable place, who don't understand that there's a pandemic, who don't believe that they should modify their behavior, who are gleeful in their defiance of public health mandates to stay home, to not gather with family and friends for Thanksgiving, to not put people in danger, to not exhaust and endanger medical carers, healthcare professionals who are in many cases not just emotionally overwhelmed, but are physically in danger from all of the exposure to COVID. Sounds like the protective gear situations in some cases is stronger, but in some hospitals as well, they're still in danger of running low on supplies. And when that happens, then hospitals, the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory therapists are all in grave danger. And if anybody slips up, they're also in grave danger. Oops. I'm trying to share a different thing, and then I realized.
Yeah, we do this to take care of, it's so frustrating. Yeah, I mean, we wear these N95s, they're tight, they leave marks. We have these face shields that come down like that. We gown, we have hair, surgical caps, gloves. We do this for 13 hours a day. People need to wear their mask for 30 minutes at the store. I mean, we do this to take care of people. They got to do that to help take care of everyone else.
Then when I get home and I get on Facebook or, various outlets and people are debating that their masks are uncomfortable or they're hot, I'm just like, well, I wish you could walk an hour in my shoes.
It's so frustrating. Yeah. I mean, we wear these N95.
So that's, the protection that these healthcare workers are wearing. They've got the really tight N95 masks, and they've got face shields that come down over the top as well, which I think it's a point nowadays to remind people not to wear face shields in isolation. They give extra protection to your eye, but they're not adequate by any means by themselves. They're not a substitute for face masks. Face masks protect the wearer, but also prevent the forcible expulsion of droplets. So they are the key defense against viral transmission. These face shields are just an extra layer of protection for the wearer. Matthew is praying that the cult falls apart quickly when Trump is gone. I know, I have the same prayer. And this dude is saying that your prayer is lacking in content, but we're going to just gloss over that dude and his emotional problems. So yes, this doctor said, Tracy K. Paul, MD, cardiologist at Cornell. She said, not sure why people think there's an infinite supply of healthcare workers. Today, we lost about a third of our usual physician and nurse unit team due to a possible exposure. We are tired. We are burnt out. Wear a mask. And Matt makes an important point to say we can stop mythologizing people as weak or strong based on their arbitrary ability to fight off illness. Thanks. Because that was in response to a comment by Senator John Kennedy, who said of Chuck Grassley, who's just been diagnosed as COVID positive, he says, the coronavirus has never met anybody like Chuck, who is more fit than your average 87-year-old. He adds that the virus will tuck its... Yeah, he says something racist, which we don't have to repeat, because whilst the virus may have originated in China, it is a terrible thing to try and deflect attention away from the malfeasance and sabotage of America's current federal leadership, i.e. the Trump administration, to just keep trying to focus attention on where the disease originated, as if that has anything to do with Trump's malfeasance, other than Trump really wanted a Chinese government signature on a trade deal to cover up the escalating manufacturing recession that was visible was evident by the end of October 2019. So Trump initially ignored the contents of his intelligence briefings and ignored warnings that China might be underplaying the seriousness of this potential pandemic situation. Trump instead just sent out multiple tweets ingratiating himself to President Xi and saying what a wonderful job they were doing in containing the virus, and whilst also minimizing the severity of the situation to the American people. And then once he did have that signature on a trade deal on January the 19th, Trump became at least slightly more realistic about the pandemic, but still chose to lie to people, because to lie about your own lies, i.e. to conceal or to distract from the degree to which you have deceived the American people and withheld federal resources from addressing a problem in the wealthiest country in the world with the most resources, the most scientific, prestigious organizations, people willing to step up and say, we'll step up domestic production of N95 masks if you but give the word. Trump declined to do any of that and instead proceeded with not stepping up mask production, not evoking the Defense Production Act, the DPA of 1950, which would have allowed him to use those powers organized after World War II to say, yep, let's formalize the president's ability to compel American companies to produce what's needed in a big crisis situation. Trump refused to do that because he also didn't want to admit he was wrong. And it turns out he was probably disinclined to help America cope through this crisis because he thought there'd be a political advantage in saying it's actually governors' responsibility to deal with this national level crisis, and that then when it proved to be too difficult for governors who don't have the same resources that the federal government has, they don't have the EPA Act that they can invoke. They had to bid against each other like rivals on eBay for limited supplies of overseas sourced protective equipment because Trump had failed to step up domestic production of such equipment. So Trump hoped to benefit from that by then blaming Democratic governors for the spread of the pandemic and for the escalating loss of life. So Trump abandoned New Yorkers to die initially, and then as it spread across the country, he continued to let his son-in-law start groups to plan for national testing strategies, but then to walk away from those plans and those groups, saying, well, it's more politically expedient for us to allow Democratic governors to take the blame for death rates in those states. Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, Republican Senator Cory Gardner, when asked if he considers Joe Biden the president-elect, responded, "You're going to play gotcha questions with me? You guys, just come on. I'm not going to play your gotcha questions. I'm not going to play your games. I'm tired of it." Which is extraordinary because Joe Biden is the president-elect. But what happens in that situation is that the media are giving them the opportunity to dodge the question. Instead of saying, are you prepared to acknowledge the reality of the situation? They're saying, do you acknowledge this? They give them too much power, but that's just a consequence of the media running rampant with a value of appearing deferential to power and pursuing the appearance of balance by giving as much credence to liars as they do to people telling the truth, which advantages liars and is rather unfortunate. Hate your love. Oh, you've got a little baby up because you hate women. Alan will block me, no question. Are you saying that governors hold zero responsibility? Not at all. I think there's a lot of Trump grifters in positions of power in Republican-controlled states or states with a Republican governor that have absolutely let down America. But they've been taking inspiration from Trump's malfeasance at the top. is true. We cannot have a conversation with these people because no matter what evidence you show them or study or facts, they won't acknowledge expert or consensus decisions. I did see one story from a nurse about someone who had COVID and was denying that he had COVID or saying he just should take some vitamin pills. It was all a beat up. And she told him he was the only COVID patient on that floor of 25 COVID patients who was capable of responding to her queries, who was awake enough to be responsive. And then when she wheeled him out of that unit to another unit, he saw all of the comatose COVID patients, and he told her he was sorry and that he would tell people his experience and the severity of the pandemic. Hello. We haven't seen Brian today. The danger of spikes is overwhelming those healthcare facilities and healthcare workers. Yes. So we're going to start talking about secondary deaths, the fact that when you have so many COVID patients that hospital systems get overwhelmed, you also then cannot access treatment easily when you have a car accident, when you have cancer. People who have metastatic breast cancer, who've been due to have a mastectomy, have had their surgery pushed back and back because hospitals are perpetually in this crisis situation. You're so welcome. Corey has to go home to rural Western Colorado, where he might start a super PAC and get rich. I hope these people become pariahs if Americans who are currently in the cult wake up to how that cult has been organized to squeeze them of their votes and abandon them to a situation where modern medical healthcare in America is brought to the point of collapse, where all of the resources of this wealthy country are no longer accessible even to them. You remember trying to tell your algebra teacher that there were correct answers on both sides. Well, what did your algebra teacher say? Corey used to be a Democrat and flipped, so he'll land on his feet. Dear. The person with the little tiny premature baby on there, that is a very, very premature looking baby. Presumably is doing that because they want to make the argument that they themselves would never suggest that a woman abort an unwanted pregnancy, that a woman declined to carry to term a child that she didn't have any intention of or interest in bringing into the world. And I'm happy to discuss late-term abortions and say, yeah, look, if there was such a thing as large-scale frivolous late-term abortions, I could see your point. Oh, just got to check it's not my children's school. Hello. No, you're not. Okay, it wasn't this school. Just spam. Where were we up to? You're so tired of being met with pure ignorance and aggression right out of the gate. Just absurd claims and attacks. If we try and step up for real facts or yourself or decency, they pearl clutch. Yes, the confected outrage. I think the solution to that might be to just ignore them as much as possible, or at least to abandon the goal of changing their minds. I mean, brainwashing is very strong. Propaganda is very strong. Historically, we can say that human nature sometimes just gets momentum behind eliminationist rhetoric, the urge to demonize political opponents and stigmatized minority subgroups like Jews in 1930s Germany case, now to a degree Jews, because if you dig into the QAnon conspiracy theories, ultimately they're blaming Jews. There's a surface veneer of we're blaming celebrities and we're blaming Bill Gates, who's not Jewish, for, as far as I know, for children being purposefully tortured and having adrenochrome extracted as a drug. That's the QAnon conspiracy theories. But if you spend more time with them than a minute, then they're ultimately saying it's Jews. Jews are doing it. Historically, there's hundreds and hundreds of years of that type of conspiracy theory. It's called the blood libel. It's got a name, saying Jewish people come for your children. And the reason for that is not that Jewish people come for your children. It's that that's the most evocative, scary thing to say to people who don't know any better and who are tempted by the excitement of learning secret knowledge. Secrets, very enticing. This is a really great time in the USA to go on a 50-day or so fishing trip. True, but you'd want maybe to have a fishing trip where there was access to wireless internet by some description. Desert solitaire, yes. So Trump's lawyer in Pennsylvania looks exactly like you'd expect Trump's lawyer to look. Yes. Alternative facts. They certainly do have a lot of alternative facts. South Dakota governor. Republicans must love her because she's attractive and has no character. So they seem to be attracted to a lot of that at the moment. Her war on tribal sovereignty is going to get people killed, suggests an article. Well, she's already getting a lot of people killed in South Dakota, isn't she? Because they've got a very high fatality rate and a very high positivity rate. And people in that healthcare system, in rural hospitals particularly, where they don't have very many ICU beds, there's going to be a lot of secondary deaths, which is people that don't even die from COVID. They die from inability to access the level of medical care they need in response to an emergency. So there she is. She's attractive. I can acknowledge that. But yes, the Republican governor has fueled South Dakota's pandemic spiral, and she's trying to take down tribal nations with her. How is she doing that? Let's have a look. It ranks second in the nation, South Dakota, for COVID cases and first in hospitalizations. Yet, as of writing, Republican Governor Kristi Noem has refused to take action in response to the uncontrolled spread in her state, rejecting measures as simple and effective as a mask mandate. She described her decision to dig in on mass death as a matter of good manners and mutual respect. If folks want to wear a mask, they are free to do so, she tweeted at the end of October. Those who don't want to wear a mask shouldn't be shamed into it, and government should not mandate it. We need to respect each other's decisions. In South Dakota, we know a little common courtesy can go a long way. So vicious because it's really the language that people might associate with everything's okay, it's all fine, all we need is a little bit of courtesy to deal with this pandemic. Yeah, so that wouldn't be surprising if North Dakota was leading the first death rate. It wouldn't surprise me if they go after the rights on South Dakota reservations, poorest counties in the US. Yes. What is she doing? So the Indian Health Service's Great Plains area, consisting of the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Iowa, posted its highest yet increase in COVID-19 cases. Unsurprisingly, whilst officials like Noem effectively cheered on the death toll, tribal governments and community leaders have taken matters into their own hands, enforcing checkpoints and lockdowns of their own. This isn't a power grab by tribes, it's an act of survival. The nearest health facility is a 3-hour drive in Rapid City for critical care, and our health facility is basically we only have 8 beds. there's only one respiratory therapist. There's probably over 10,000 residents that live on the reservation. So if we were to have a massive outbreak, where are they going to go? But as the tribes have moved to shield themselves against the irresponsibility of state and local governance, they have been met with outright hostility from leaders like Noam. Hear that again: elected officials in South Dakota, operating out of a desire to make tribal communities effectively submissive to local and state governance, are working against their native counterparts who are actively trying to save lives in the middle of a pandemic. There does not exist a descriptor that adequately captures the level of cruelty and malice required to pursue such policies while South Dakotans die. As Noam was bragging about getting to breathe on Trump and throwing her support behind a super spreader event in July, Fraser and the Cheyenne River Sayo tribe government established checkpoints along roads entering the tribe's reservation to check incoming vehicles to slow the spread of the virus. The stops were non-invasive and quick-moving, the kind of screening people face when walking into some restaurants and other shops across the country. But Noam fought the checkpoints, arguing that the Cheyenne River Sayo tribe government did not have the jurisdiction to stop traffic. Wow. So anyway, that is, I'll share the link to that article because I think it's important for people to see how Republicans sometimes misuse legal fights to sabotage people's ability to protect those in their community. Matthew's question is about the end game for Trump people. If Trump controlled the presidency, the Department of Homeland Security, the Senate, and most governorships, and still managed to have the election stolen. Yes, well, it is a concern, isn't it? That how do people even find it plausible that the Democrats stole the election when Trump controls so much of the executive branch of government and has in fact consolidated a lot of power in the executive branch at the expense of the legislative branch, let alone stacking the judicial branch through the actions not just of Trump, but of Mitch McConnell purposefully blocking Obama's ability to fill judicial vacancies, leaving all of those judge seats empty until there was a Republican president, i.e. Trump, who then filled as many judicial seats as possible with very conservative people who are often underqualified for the position and are cognizant of owing Trump a favor for their lifetime cushy jobs. Yes, they started the Midwest spread. Sturgis really kickstarted the Midwest spread, yes. I think they've traced like 276,000 cases of COVID now to that event, which was a 10-day super spreader event of a large motorcycle rally in South Dakota. So no wonder Kirsty Noem's really digging in her heels behind her behavior, because the more people you kill, the more stubborn you get in denying you've done something wrong in the first place, I guess. Alan enjoys playing Whack-A-Troll to reduce tension. Are you able to log on YouTube, Alan? Because we have a troll. Yes, that's how Cheyenne Sayo, thank you. Sayo, yes, that's how it was spelled. It's a cultural event like a tractor pull with motorcycles and tattoos. You're not sure if Obama could have done more, but in hindsight, you wish he would have fought harder. Irish people had turned up to midterm elections and voted in a supportive Congress, because I think the big mistake people make is to assume Obama could have done more, but to have presumed that Obama was operating in isolation because people massively underplay the role of Congress. I mean, they disparage Congress, but they don't understand that Republicans in Congress act over and over again to establish legislation and policies undertaken to improve the lot of the general public. Harder for judges. Oh, if it's spelled like that, then in the US it's pronounced Sue. Oh no, pronounced Sio in the US and then Sue in French. Okay. There's no bail relief, fortunately, for the 2 armed QAnon members from Virginia who drove to Philadelphia on November the 5th to straighten out the vote with their guns. The district attorney said they should be treated as suspects in a mass shooting that was narrowly averted. So that's good. Joseph Massier and Antonio LaMotta, 2 armed Virginia men who drove to Philadelphia. Very fortunate that they were stopped. They had a QAnon hat in the back of their truck and a parking ticket saying violation on it. So glad their car was searched. So glad that that mass shooting was prevented. And may all such mass shootings by Trump supporters be averted. This is just a little piece on how YouTube, which I'm currently broadcasting to, is doing bad things in terms of still algorithms that lead people to increasingly more and more extremist videos, more and more detached from reality. And that the CEO, Susan, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Wojcicki, why isn't she getting grilled by Congress and appearing in the same congressional hearings as Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter? For some reason, she's managed to keep her head down, be quiet, and let other platforms take the heat. So she's not watching here, but that is a point of concern for me, that by using the YouTube platform, I don't really want to be supporting the actions of someone like that who is undermining democracy for profit. Alan can only moderate on Periscope. No worries, Alan. The funniest thing about the QAnon weirdos is that no evidence proves how the deep state, they take it as supportive that there's no evidence to prove their position, because that proves that the deep state is covering things up. So their official position is that being debunked proves them right, because being a member of QAnon is not a function of sane engagement with facts. It's a function of being emotionally disturbed. And an emotional disturbance is a product of brainwashing for consenting adults. So I do hold people responsible for being brainwashed, but I know also it sometimes happens to people who would have said outright that they rejected the idea of being brainwashed to become rabid conservatives, people who might have formerly been advocates for civil rights for Black Americans and advocates for civil rights for gay Americans. But once they hit retirement and they're exposed to Fox News or conservative radio whilst driving, just become people with a completely different organization of morality and principles. Okay, so now we're going to go through something that's quite heavy. Kim says it's pronounced Sue in US. Okay, Sue, like that? Yeah, sorry, Alan, I didn't mean to pressure you to jump on YouTube. I'm dealing with a lot of YouTube spam, but the good thing is there's still some lovely commentators from YouTube, so I'm not regretting talking to them as well. I value your comments, sane YouTube commenters. Yes, Somebody with Putin in their name is saying that US is way ahead of a lot of the world, which is why it's so tragic and unfortunate that there's such a high toll. Oh, we have some Luke's back. Hello, Luke. Yes, Michigan certified the results. It's done, but misinformation is rampant. We know. Oh, when all of this is done, suggests Marty, Trump will be compared to Custer, defeated by the Sioux and General Patton. Bless your heart, delightful audience. That's true. You're right, Alan. Thank you for bringing up that good side of the trolls. They do help with numbers. They help with an algorithm that drives viewership. So the upside of being able to practice the zenness of troll ignoring is welcoming more audience numbers. Thank you. I appreciate that. So we're going to go through, there's a bit of a trigger warning. This is a historical analysis and it's going to have some confronting photos in it. So you have to be tough if you want to stay with me while I walk through this thread. It's by an author. He wrote a book called Red Pill, Blue Pill, How to Counteract the Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us. So he writes, and he wrote this in 2018, eliminationism is a term you need not just to become familiar with, but to understand, especially in today's American rush towards authoritarianism. This is a long illustrated thread explaining what it means, how it works, and why Donald Trump is now our eliminationist in chief. So here's a little handmade sign saying Trump Nation whites only, which is a very honest sign. So the Confederacy flag is essentially saying the same thing. So is the Nazi flag that they sometimes bring out as well. And so are those Trump signs, really. All right. So it's a long thread. Yes. What do we mean by eliminationism? This is the academic definition. Eliminationism is the belief that one's political opponents are a cancer on the body politic that must be excised, either by separation from the public at large, through censorship, or outright extermination in order to protect the purity of the nation. It was largely coined by Holocaust scholar Daniel Jonah Goldhagen in his 1966 book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, about the role ordinary Germans played in the Holocaust, which he described as fuel by eliminationist anti-Semitism. Hang on just a second. Woo! Hello? Hello? For who? Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. So did we get to that eliminationist anti-Semitism? Thank you for your patience. So this is on Twitter. It's a thread from November the 1st, 2018. So you can use the Twitter search bar and just put in eliminationism and it'll be, you can scroll through the results. The poster is David Newert. You'll love it. All right. Okay, so where are we up to? Eliminationist anti-Semitism. The book describes how, in reality, the largest numbers of Jews and other victims killed by Nazi directive were round up and gunned down or immolated en masse and buried in mass graves. 1 second. Thank you. Okay. Hopefully there won't be any more interruptions. I think that was a delivery for somebody else. Yep, it is. She got the address wrong. All right. Oh dear, it's sad to be laughing. This is not a cheerful topic. Okay. So the largest number of Jews and other victims killed by Nazi directive were often rounded up by ordinary Germans and non-Jewish residents of German-occupied territories. There's a scholarly discussion of it, which anybody can visit for themselves if they want to. But as he's explained previously, elimination first is expressed in rhetoric, and then that rhetoric inspires action. It's a rhetorical twofer expressing both contempt, placing the target beneath them, and disgust, evoking the impulse to purify. Eliminationist rhetoric has very distinct and immediately identifiable traits. It always depicts its opposition as simply beyond the pale, and in the end, the embodiment of evil itself, unfit for participation in their vision of society and thus in need of elimination. And I think it's also important to recognize that when we hear that eliminationist rhetoric a lot, sometimes it motivates us to talk in a similar way ourselves about them, but we don't have to do that. We don't have to extend and adopt ourselves eliminationist rhetoric. But the motivation grows stronger the more and more that they cause death. I understand that. But yes, eliminationist rhetoric often depicts its enemy as vermin, especially rats and cockroaches or lice. So these are obviously historic posters depicting Jewish people as rats. It also associates them with disease, depicting them either as diseases outright or as carriers of horrible diseases such as leprosy. We have seen multiple recent examples of this, thanks again to Lou Dobbs and Fox News. So Fox running headline saying, US-Mexico cross-border health risks. Claiming that any disease in the US obviously would be a product of migrants. It's now going to be a near impossible task to get racism back in the tube. Yes, and Kevin Sorboss, we'll go to a more cheerful thing next, but Kevin Sorboss, an actor from Hercules, said, oh, so people who claim to have defeated fascism are now making lists. Ha ha. And someone wrote, yes, as seen in that, obviously well-known documentary, that time we just decided to move on and not prosecute anybody in the Nuremberg trials. They expressed it more comically than I did, but still. I'm going back to the thread, which says, at other times, the enemies are depicted as invaders or their presence as an invasion. So this is an ad, what is it? Re-elect somebody, James D. Fallon, as a US Senator and let him finish the work he has now underway to stop the silent invasion. So I think really that illustrates that Trump is not a novel phenomenon. He's just something that disconcerts people who thought we were better than that. So that's part of our innocence that we have to shed, because spending so much time being puzzled and dismayed is a drain on our energy, and we need our energy to mount effective opposition against the current iteration of fascism. So shake off the dismay. Yes, Trump happens. Fascism rears its ugly head periodically because, as Freud would say, we all have an id, the most basic base tribal impulses, which are a product of our need to identify threats and then overcome our normal caring, sharing human impulses to become the type of people who can fight in defense. It's just that those impulses are easily abused by exploitative and depraved individuals who purposefully rile up that id, that aggressive self, not to defend against real threats, but to take any pre-existing identification of threats and then spin it, amplify it so much it becomes distorted. and not based in reality anymore, and that you start to cultivate mass levels of aggression, first rhetorical aggression, but to also inspire real aggression against a stigmatized subgroup. And then that also includes something that wasn't written about at the time this thread was written, but mass death by negligence as well. So the Americans that have heard Trump's rhetoric against migrants don't care that people in prisons or that people in migrant dominant industries or Black American dominant industries are suffering more. Because yes, they'll just write off the pandemic as something that happens in New York to their hated enemies, the Democrats. A slightly less virulent variation on this are claims that opponents are traitors who will stab us in the back, or criminals, or gross liabilities for our national security, and are thus inherently fit for elimination or at least incarceration. Regardless, any target of eliminationist rhetoric is depicted as a threat to the purity of the country, of the community, with clear sexual overtones. They are often depicted as threats to virtuous white womanhood, that is, potential rapists. And yes, it's often voiced as crude jokes, the humor of which, when analyzed, is inevitably predicated on venomous hatred. So yep, you probably have seen these type of really aggressive, vicious memes, things that say liberal hunting permit. Yep. We'll gas the Jews and make Israel pay for it. Yes, so that's some very virulent fascist material. But, oh dear, that is a picture of the bodies of Jewish people in a pit, but I will just minimize that for a second. The most important aspect of eliminationism, however, is how it functions, i.e. what it does. It creates permission. And what it creates permission for ultimately is the unleashing of our darkest id, our violence. It's easier to kill something you see as vermin. And I'll extrapolate from that now because this thread was written before COVID. And I'll say it's easier to decide not to wear a mask when you think the people that are dying are predominantly Black or predominantly Democrats, anybody that you have stigmatized as being a libtard and undesirable. I mean, a libtard is a variant of the word retard, which is from the word retarded, which is a now disdained method of referring to people with developmental delays or mental neurodiversity. But of course, to remember that people with neurodiversity were also gassed in Hitler's camps. So when they repeatedly call Democrats libtards, they are conditioning their emotions to welcome our deaths, basically. Not to say that there will necessarily be a civil war, but that there's an unofficial civil war raging, which is that Trump supporters won't wear masks or socially distance in a majority of cases, because they've been conditioned to be cavalier about our lives and to not notice if their own lives and their own communities are suffering irreparably from being collateral damage from their own racist, fascist conditions, impulses to be negligent about the lives of others. So we've seen before in history the product of such cultivation of the worst of human impulses. Elimination, this is getting more historically, going back further now. Elimination is buried pretty deeply in the European psyche, closely associated with early Christian notions of filth and purification, which often related to violent means of ridding the world of sources of contamination, including self-flagellation. It also grew out of early Christian beliefs about the world outside of their own, particularly wild places full of savages who were not always deemed humans. Those same beliefs became closely associated with other views about filth and contamination, the domain of women. So that would appear to be an illustration of a woman being suspended by her hands What era are we suggesting that in? Does that look like the Inquisition? Could be. Just Dark Ages. All right, the most egregious outbreaks of eliminationism in early Europe were the anti-Jewish pogroms that began in about the 12th century and were often associated with returning crusaders. So more illustrations of the mass murder of Jews. And there they're setting them on fire, having chained them to pyres and poking them with pitchforks. This later morphed into phenomena such as the various Inquisitions, notably those in Spain, which featured mass killing events known as autos de fe, if I'm pronouncing that properly. Humanity can be pretty dark sometimes. It's funny how they'll say emotionalism in one breath and then immediately pivot to appeal to our empathy. That's in reference to a YouTube commenter who called me emotionalism. I shouldn't pay attention to him. But these are also important comments that 80% of the military vote went to Biden. The reason most often given in interviews has been abandoning the Kurds, and that every general in Trump's cabinet has said he's a psycho. Yes. Yes, the F your feelings crowd always have the most feelings. Not necessarily. I think we often more empathetically connected to things because people who are sucked up in a fascist vacuum of a fascist rhetoric tornado are often stuck on glee. They're gleeful about their perceived power as being on the winning side, of the super winning side, of the super all-powerful macho Rambo super tough president. But yes, thank you, Marty Blue. It's important, I think, to give voice to our emotional response, even to model emotions for people who have become emotionally distant from the rest of humanity. Yes, and I think it's important for us to get more comfortable with embracing emotions. I think some of our modern culture has people apologizing for venting, and maybe that makes us more detached from young people who do have a lot of emotions, who have been brought up in an era where adults are not seen as responsible because climate change is seen as a real problem that they learn about and then have to go out into the world and realize that adult leadership is not doing anything about it. They get taught the science or a degree of the science from primary school, from infancy even, but to grow up to adulthood in the modern era has been to lack the emotional stability of having competent adult leadership precede you. Have I read The Painting of Dorian Gray? It's very apropos as an analogy for conservatives. They project all their insecurity onto others because looking in the mirror could destroy them. I'm sure we all have a tendency to do that to a certain extent. There's various psychological defense mechanisms that we're all subject to. But at this moment in time, yes, there's a lot of pain and suffering being inflicted on the rest of us from conservatives who are failing to reckon with reality. When Europeans arrived on the American continent, this attitude was translated neatly into the genocidal treatment of the indigenous population there. Indeed, early Spanish invaders used autos de fe as a means of imposing discipline on the Mayan natives. So the mass murder of Mayan natives depicted in this, do you call it I've forgotten the term for drawings of this nature. But again, this is awful, but we're just dealing with the darkness of humanity so that we remember it's okay to have emotions. We remember it's okay to admit that humans over time have done very bad things. It's not isolated to people from America. It's not isolated to people from Spain. it's not isolated necessarily to white people, but I mean, there have been colonizers from nations with other skin colors. I mean, Japan has worked to colonize nations such as South Korea, but there's been a lot of white people involved in colonizing and genocide of other nations. So that's just, it's okay to keep that in mind. It's okay to be honest about it. It's okay to have the moral gravitas to reckon with it without surrendering ourselves to feeling depressed by that association. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Not that the historical facts don't matter, but that it doesn't matter to our lives and to our consciences to be associated with the depravity of others. We have to say, yep, it's not great. We don't feel proud of it, but it's not a personal reflection on us. We have to be independent in our morality. I think just some white nationalists, some racist neo-Nazis would just say, oh, well, we want to be proud of ourselves. We want to say across time and history, we've always done the right thing. So that attachment to something really is a growing need to lie about history, a growing need to pretend that nothing bad ever happened, that slavery is all in the past, that Jim Crow, who even it's not as well known around the world what Jim Crow even was. I don't really know, to make that frank admission. Actually, from my understanding at the moment, I would say Jim Crow is the reversion to loss of voting rights for Black Americans after Reconstruction. So there was Civil War, the abolishment of slavery. Reconstruction had troops from the North stationed in the South to prevent acts of retaliation against Black Americans, but Black Americans could then vote and elected Black officials to Congress, and that there was then uprisings, a coup against the governance of the US, and the compromise was then drawn after a lot of people were killed, including a lot of Black people who had the audacity to vote, and attempted murders of Black congressional representatives and some successful murders as well, that Jim Crow was the overturning of the rights granted to Black Americans during Reconstruction, and that was then left in place, and segregation was then left in place until the Civil Rights era and the signing of the Civil Rights Act in perhaps 1964. So yes, when Colonel James Chivington ordered his men to massacre women and children at Sand Creek in Colorado in 1864, he justified it with the exhortation, "Nits make lice." An estimated 500 people, all natives, were killed. These attitudes remained intact among American whites well after the genocide of Native Americans had been more or less completed in the 1880s. Indeed, after the outcome of the Civil War, eliminationist racism became much more focused on freed American slaves. Yep. Uh-oh. In self-defense, Southern chivalry, if I hadn't killed you, you would have grown up to rule me. So this is a cartoon drawn to condemn the actions of Southern people who killed and murdered Black Americans. But yes, so they've depicted someone there as shooting a small Black child with the self-defense with the argument of, if I hadn't killed you, you would have grown up to rule me, showing that what's seen as most objectionable in that argument is the displacement of the hierarchy, that if they have a hierarchy of superiority that they've internalized, they find it intolerable to accept that a Black person could succeed, could be voted into Congress, etc. Alan, don't apologize. Sleep is very important, as you always tell me, and I'm grateful for it. Matthew says, I think kids being so smart, engaged, and emotionally mature is a tremendous accomplishment. I thought that was the point of education and what we've been working for as a society. Yes, although some generations, Gen Z and millennial generations, sometimes come under criticism now for lacking work ethic. So they're very aware of their rights and then their needs to look after themselves, but they're sometimes not as willing as, or they're sometimes deemed to be not as willing as others in a generalization sense of devoting themselves to a company or to a pursuit outside of something they've organized for themselves. Matthew's also pointing out that a general losing an incumbent losing an election is very rare. Yes, it's been 30 years. So hopefully, says Matthew, we can expect 8 years of democratic leadership, if not more, with current shifting demographics. Yes, but we have to do a lot to acknowledge the very activated forces of the last gasp of white demographic dominance, because those people are really striving to maximize their opportunity to overthrow democracy, whilst there still is this strong, well, there is still a majority of white people in America, because in demographic terms, soon there will not be a majority of white people in America. Good night, Alan. Lovely to see you. All right, most elimination rhetoric portrayed blacks as inherently criminal and lazy, and black men as an omnipresent rape threat. That threat was used to justify literally thousands of extra-legal lynchings between 1880 and 1940 in what became known as the lynching era. So that's a tree with four different black men being hung. Apologizing for anybody who's late to this lesson. We've already preemptively said that it's got some very distressing images. Lynching was a cornerstone of the legal disenfranchisement of black people after the Civil War in the South, which was better known as Jim Crow. The black populace was terrorized into submitting to this disenfranchisement by the threat of being hanged. What's extraordinary is, I think, ties that I see some of the people wearing. There are children who are dressed up for this occasion. There's a young man in the right corner wearing a tie and a young child wearing a tie there as well. So that really centers this picture in modern America, the building behind with the glass in the windows as well, very modern, and still a black man being hung in order to deter other black men from voting. Much of this history has intentionally been buried for decades, and white people are shocked to learn about it now as it resurfaces. Most black people, on the other hand, have been aware of it for years. Eliminationist rhetoric had a psychosexual component. It described men as black beasts and jungle animals and dwelt on black men's physical features and virility. Black lynchings were unique in that the victims were mutilated, usually mutilated sexually. Lynched white people were not. The attitudes underlying this eliminationism were common, not just in the South, but throughout the country. This is why the sundown town phenomenon was most prominent outside the South. That's important to know, so we don't just overgeneralize into racism being located in the South. Sundown towns, which had ordinances forbidding black residency after sunset, were explicitly eliminationist in nature. Whites only within city limits after dark. Reads that sign. They were often associated with a racial cleansing event in which the black neighborhood of a town would be burned out and its residents forced to flee. They called these race riots. They reached a peak in 1919 in what was called the Red Summer. The largest of these occurred in Tulsa in 1921, in what had once been an economically prosperous black district. White men in planes dropped incendiary bombs from planes during the assault. So you can see this picture, courtesy of the Oklahoma Historical Society. Lots of smoke, burning buildings, and someone's written on the photo, running the Negro out of Tulsa, June 1921. Asians were also the target of eliminationism. First came the Chinese, who were first to arrive in the West with the railroad crews that crossed the continent. Inevitably, they became the target of nativists, many of them involved in labor unions who saw them as competition. So I support unions, but I don't support it when unionisms get the bug, get the contagion of anti-migrant rhetoric and eliminationism. So that's a picture of what a stereotypical Chinese person with a pigtail and what looks like a wooden device, which would be something to wash with, and some money. And it says the Chinese must go. Indeed, the idea to build that wall around the United States of America, says the cartoon, throwing down the ladder by which they rose. So this cartoon is celebrating white people building a wall and then going to America, moving to America, and then throwing down the ladder. Oh, and the ladder says immigration. So is this cartoon celebrating what white people are doing, or is it condemning them and saying, yep, they've immigrated to America and now they are throwing down the ladder so that they can't allow Asian people to move to America? I think it might be a cartoon condemning racism. That would be nice. Asians in general were depicted in nativist propaganda as inhuman, insidious, even demonic. They also showed how eliminationist rhetoric translated into mass death. White miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming, went on a rampage in September 1885, wiping out a Chinese community estimated at between 700 to 900 people. Yep, so there you can see in the right side of the picture, the white miners depicted as shooting, fleeing Chinese migrants, carrying their belongings on their back as they leave. After the passage in 1872 of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which outlawed immigration from China, railroad companies who were still competing lines across the continent decided to recruit labor from Japan to replace the Chinese. By 1900, their numbers became substantial. So here's some, still loading. Here's some workers from Japan. Okay. Unsurprisingly, nativist elements soon seized upon the Japanese immigration just as it had relative to the Chinese immigrants. To demonize them as unassimilable and demand the flow be stopped, the immigration was labeled an invasion and the immigrants' presence was labeled a menace. And look at the question in the Seattle Star. Is this to remain white man's land? More revelations made in Jap menace. Oh, and gosh, there's a little subset here in the article saying what Japs own here. So Japs, derogatory terminology in a newspaper, and again, this underlying premise that white people own the United States and that migrants who come to the United States to help build things and contribute to American prosperity and achievements are in some ways welcomed, and in some places nativist elements use nativist rhetoric to stir up hatred and violence. Good evening. Hello. Matthew is suggesting that reparations or debt forgiveness or something is necessary for reconciliation. Yeah, it'd be great. My latest thought is just looking at areas where there's just most discrepancy now. So maybe overcoming some of the racism, the systemic racism that's still evident in the behavior of banks, who are less likely to loan to people of color, who are more likely to undervalue properties owned by Black people, and the fact that debt college debt is being disproportionately felt by Black Americans as higher education becomes more expensive, and then the interest rates are compound interest rates, which makes it really difficult to pay that debt off, particularly if you don't have familial wealth providing a cushion for you. And Black Americans are less likely to have familial wealth because redlining policies have made banks fail to lend appropriately to Black Americans over recent American history. So I think there's a workaround rather than saying reparations to people, which often does antagonize white people who don't adequately understand American history. Student debt relief is a good thing to consider later. Not right now because for reasons I'll expound on later, but I think it's a good thing. Yes, and a lot of the Japanese internment camps in World War II were actually driven by Californian growers associations that were threatened by the success of Japanese agricultural methods and the success of Japanese American farmers. And they advocated to the government to detain Japanese Americans in camps. All right, so the hysteria around Japanese immigration became known as the Yellow Peril, in which Japanese immigrant farmers were depicted as an insidious, invasive horde, plotting the eventual invasion of the Pacific coast by the emperor. It was intertwined with the popularity of racial eugenics, led by a couple of bestsellers that depicted Asian immigration as the most dire, essential threat facing America: The Passing of the Great Race and The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. So basically, when people embrace this type of eliminationist rhetoric, they're not just being racist, and they're not just being violent and nihilistic. They're abandoning the opportunity to cooperate. So some in America have welcomed migrants and really helped embrace the general improvements that have occurred as a result of the contributing energy of migrants. Now, I often link to Harvard Business Review articles which show data for, and I guess we can briefly switch to looking at that. Just to look at the screen title indicating data shows that migrants are more likely to start and sustain businesses in the United States. So here the headline is Immigrants Play a Disproportionate Role in American Entrepreneurship. So there's obviously a lot of negative propaganda around migrants, but with many places looking to stoke economic growth, lots of state and local governments have clamored to launch initiatives to attract more immigrant entrepreneurs, hoping that they will found businesses and create more jobs. So that still occurs in the context of people like Trump, who covertly campaign on an anti-migration platform, even as they ostensibly say, and a lot of Trump supporters will tell you, oh, I only support the reduction of illegal immigration to the United States or undocumented migrants being present. In the United States, the truth of the matter is that the Trump administration has massively cut legal immigration. They've blocked a lot of legal visas, and they've rendered a lot of people's residency in the United States illegal by cancelling their temporary protection status visas and revoking the visas of other people. So there's a lot of people whose legal status has changed as a consequence of the Trump administration and the anti-migration tendencies of fascist-minded white nationalist Stephen Miller. So these are immigrant entrepreneurship trends in the US, because particularly overrepresented in entrepreneurship statistics are people who migrated to the United States as a child. So apparently that just really takes advantage of the best of both worlds, having exposure to the work ethic of migrants, who are often people prepared to abandon the comfort and security of wherever they used to live, or they're prepared to abandon familiarity in the pursuit of advantage somewhere else. So the pursuit of safety and economic opportunity in the US. So they have the chutzpah not to stay and potentially die where they were if they were under threat or just faced reduced opportunity where they were, but to bring that chutzpah and that courage to the United States. And that brings with it a work ethic, an interest in obtaining educational success, and an interest in starting and sustaining businesses as well. So that was the Harvard Business Review article that we read, that we just had a look at, so I recommend it to people. So now we're going back to the thread here. So all of this agitation against the white race being threatened, the passing of the great race, Madison Grant, the rising tide of color, all very hate amplifying rhetoric. All this agitation translated into legislation and policy, including court rulings that affirmed that Asians were ineligible for naturalization, as well as a host of state laws such as alien land laws that were designed to disenfranchise Japanese immigrants. So it's so funny, America has this contradictory relationship with migrants. On one hand, welcoming and embracing migrants and the advantages to America of migration, and then hateful rhetoric that seeks to weaponize hatred and distrust and tribalism. Oh, wow, there was an Immigration Act of 1924, which was known in the press at the time as the Asian Exclusion Act. It forbade any further immigration of any kind from Japan or anywhere else in Asia, and it formed the basis of our current immigration law. The eliminationist attitudes about the Japanese were very much alive 17 years later when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, especially the belief that those farmers were secret shock troops for the emperor waiting for their signal. These attitudes fueled the hysteria that swept the Pacific coast after the outbreak of war with Japan and eventually led to their forced removal or incarceration in concentration camps for the war's duration. So the thing about taking people out of their homes and putting them in camps is that you make the government responsible for their welfare instead of benefiting from people's natural impetus to work and provide for themselves. So when the government has to provide for thousands and thousands of people, the government can get sloppy. And people can also be housed in very debilitating conditions. Maybe we'll have to do some of this later. One last bit. American eliminationism was key to the development of the fascist agenda in Europe. Hitler in Mein Kampf credited the genocide of Native Americans for inspiring his notion of Lebensraum, living space, and Jim Crow laws inspired the Nuremberg laws. Eliminationism became much less popular after the war, and the reality came home from Europe, showing the world the real world results of that type of rhetoric. And so we don't see all of the hundreds of thousands of bodies now of COVID victims, but Trump's embrace of eliminationist rhetoric has hardened the hearts of people who support him and hardened their ability to process advice from medical professionals who ask them to save lives by wearing a mask and keeping safe distances from each other and avoiding going to mass events like church or concerts or motorcycle rallies, etc. Matthew, I'm going to ask you not to engage with the troll because do you know what? They like doing it. And I don't want to feed the mental pathologies of someone who just is stuck in an adversarial pattern. So please don't talk to them. And I know I don't always set a perfect example on that front. Sometimes I talk to them myself, but I'm going to ask you now not to engage, please, as a favor. But this is an interesting point you're making. Self-loathing turned into aggression because getting help or being kind is sometimes seen as a moral failing, and whiteness and masculinity can sometimes considered as superior. And yes, sometimes they despise people on food stamps and cheer when Trump ends food stamp provisions for people in poverty. They're also often assuming that people who get food stamps are Black Americans, which is not an accurate understanding of who constitutes the majority of welfare recipients in the United States. I was actually in Provident of Fauci. You're misspelling Fauci, by the way, but that's okay. It's F-A-U-C-H-I. And Fauci ended up saying, I originally deterred people from wearing masks because that was my comment to the public. I didn't want them panicking and buying masks when there was a limited supply of masks for use by medical professionals. And while I am talking to you, Dwight, I'll let you know as well that the numbers you see of people watching are just on YouTube, and that my audience is primarily on Periscope, and you don't seem to have access to those numbers. And that, yes, I'm very capable of asking a man to do something, and real men are very capable of accepting suggestions from women without finding that in some way a reversion or a perversion of some kind of hierarchy of authority. But yes, it was not the right thing for Fauci to do that, originally to try and discourage people from mask wearing. But I would suggest that he was being too strongly influenced by Trump at that point. He also made a mistake in saying that Italy hadn't had a ban on travel from China, when Italy did earlier than the United States. And of course, Trump had a fake Chinese travel ban in that he made exceptions for Americans being repatriated from Wuhan. So 40,000 people came in the early stages of the pandemic from Wuhan to America. But Trump is using that rhetoric of people believing that white people can't carry a disease. So 40,000 people coming from the US to China after Trump instituted his travel ban, and lies that Joe Biden called it xenophobic. Trump used the term Chinese virus when describing the travel ban, and Biden responded by saying that Trump's behavior was xenophobic. But he wasn't referencing the travel ban, which medical experts were advising. He was referencing Trump's use of the phrase China ban, which is xenophobic in that it seeks to heap blame on the Chinese and falsely build an association in people's minds between China and the virus, rather than focusing on what proactive steps can be done to protect Americans. It's destructively, irrationally xenophobic to seek to blame people for something when you are behaving in a way that sabotages public health. I guess that's one of the true meanings of racism, is not responding to threats, but irrationally responding to perceived threats. The LGBTQ community became a popular target of eliminationist rhetoric in the 1970s and 80s, even as gay rights became a reality. During the 1980s AIDS crisis, it was not uncommon for gay-bashing Christians to argue for the forced removal of gays in a quarantine. Oh, and Matt, the reason why I'm encouraging ignoring Dwight is because it's more boring for them when people don't engage, I think. So if they get bored enough so that they stop pestering people and instead maybe just listen quietly, that's cool. Or if they get bored and go away, that's also cool too. I mean, preferably the bored of fighting with people and instead just listening is nice. Probably hard to listen. They probably have such a rusted on carapace of delusion that it's hard to penetrate that with any discussion of history or facts or cartoons or headlines. You can't get through because they've formed an identity. It's very much identity politics for them of resistance and hatred for feminists and people on the left and people who support social security and people who support public health measures and people who support undocumented migrants and say, actually, undocumented migrants pay billions of dollars in tax each year through their individual tax numbers or ITNs. And no, they're disproportionately underrepresented in crime statistics. Native-born Americans are more likely to commit crimes than migrant Americans, whether documented or undocumented. But it's an old tactic to have an unwelcome guest hypothesis that migrants are here under sufferance, and therefore if even one migrant commits a crime, that's an argument to harass and prosecute and oppose and detain all or any migrants who don't have documents. That the outrage factor is so amped up when they say this crime particularly is so unfair. Many people are the victims of crimes from white people, but if there's a crime committed by a migrant, this is an outrage, and we must perpetually cycle through this outrage. Alan couldn't sleep. Thanks, Matthew. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Dwight, sweetie, I know Matthew asked you not to talk to him, but I mean, you're treating him as an intellectual equal. I'm not going to do that. He can't. Well, I'll just give him some spelling tips. Okay, hypocrisy. If you look it up, you'll learn something today. Same with periscope. Alan's happy to moderate on YouTube if I like. We're doing okay. We're doing okay at the moment. Yes, Fauci wanted to preserve protective equipment from panic buying, but I would have preferred it if he'd instead delicately put pressure on the Trump administration to evoke the Defense Production Act and increase domestic mask production. America would have been massively better off if that had happened, rather than pressure put on the public to not buy masks or to not perceive masks as useful, because it undermines the credibility of medical researchers and medical professionals incredibly that Fauci originally did that and then reversed position, said, oh no, masks aren't effective, you don't need to wear them. And then later on said, okay, well, they are effective, but I just wanted to leave the mask for the medical professionals initially. As you can see from Dwight's comments recently here. Actually, you probably can't see them because they're on YouTube. Let's see if I can find a Dwight comment. Brian's here. Hello, Brian. How are you today? Thank you, Matthew. Bless you. Yes, and we're sure you're exhausted. Must be really hard. Oh, thank you, Kim. You appreciated my. Oh, oops. Phone's run out of battery. You appreciated my analogy. I love that. Thank you for repeating my words back to me, and I encourage anybody to do that if they're ever struck by a combination of words that I've said, because then I'll take a photo of it, and it's easier for me to look back afterwards. I deliver to the internet on a regular basis a stream of consciousness of thinking, but I know some of it would be good written down. I know it. I am a little bit of a snob. It's true. Look, sweetie, I'm an educator, and it's an old habit. I also think it's really important to encourage people like you to have a degree more of intellectual humility. Not only can you not spell critical words that you use. I mean, if you didn't use them, then we wouldn't know that you couldn't spell them. But more importantly, the lack of interest in correct spelling is a very revealing complementary characteristic to your lack of interest in facts and evidence, as much as you keep chanting for me to link sources for everything or to produce sources. I've been walking you through a historically grounded story of racism and eliminationist rhetoric in the United States, whilst you endeavor to distract everybody and belittle my scope and say that the audience is small, which it isn't. And then belittle people who are kind enough to follow my suggestions. So yes, not perfect, do have a little bit of a tendency to correct people's grammar and spelling, but that's my educational background as well. So the place for me that I have room to grow is in accepting that dyslexic people and neurodiverse people exist, and they often have very valid intellectual contributions to make. But when somebody's not making a valid intellectual contribution and has in fact been harassing me substantially for a long period of time, then that's when I become more comfortable in indulging my snobbishness, as you say, my intellectual disdain for people who don't take an interest in spelling words, even when they're typing out derisive commentary on somebody's educational broadcast. So back to the history we're working through, this very, very educational thread from an author called David Newart, who's written Red Pill, Blue Pill, How to Counteract the Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us. So clever. That was published by Prometheus in 2020. But this thread itself was written in 2018. Wow, so there was even a 1986 initiative in California led by Lyndon LaRouche's cult titled Proposition 64 that was intended to enable health officials to quarantine gay people by incarcerating them. Of course, it's not useful. Not useful, is it, to quarantine gay people when AIDS is also transmitted amongst heterosexual people and people who use needles to inject drugs and by various means. So just pretending that a pandemic affects a subset of the population is a really great way to endanger the rest of the population. Gay bashing hate crimes became popular with right-wing thugs too. And of course, laws against hate crimes were targeted by religious right anti-LGBTQ organizations and are resisted by them to this day. Oh, I'm going to presume that might be the place where Matthew Shepard was tortured and killed. And there's a cross with some rocks on the ground, and it's a fence, and he doesn't stipulate what that is. So I'm just going to guess that that's a memorial place of Matthew Shepard's death. That was an awful death. In the 1990s, those of us who monitor right-wing extremists observed that many white supremacist groups were shifting their gears to begin recruiting around the issue of immigration in a focused manner. And sure enough, we started hearing the rhetoric. Immigration without assimilation is not immigration, it's an invasion. So this is all precursors to Trumpism, isn't it? Canada, United States. I can't work out the term that they've used to put above Mexico. I can see Mexico in black writing, but the font is too 1990s for me to make it out. It says AZTLAR. As well, I don't even understand, but I presume they're trying to suggest that the United States is shrinking because of migration. So it was familiar. They, just like nativist rhetoric directed at waves of immigrants before, they claimed that migrants were leeching off taxpayers, taking jobs, bringing crime and diseases, that they were a plot to destroy white America. They would never fit in as Americans. So there's Lou Dobbs, who obviously has a very established history now in that kind of anti-migrant rhetoric. It melded with the remnants of the 1990s paranoid patriot militia movement and emerged as the Minutemen, vigilante border watchers, who were going to stop immigrants coming over the border and the New World Order along with it. They talked about shooting border crossers. So that looks like a reporter in a Minutemen house. Looks not particularly tidy. There's some Minutemen watching the border and putting up, what, metal spikes. Oh, this is like a precursor to Trump's wall. Dispatch US Army troops to the Mexico border, more funding for border patrol. Okay. Of course, undocumented migrants have cropped up a lot of American industries. Lyndon LaRouche. So, yep, 1964 propositions to quarantine forcibly quarantine gay Americans. The irony of red pill being used by the people engaging in the conspiracy, when the metaphor for the red pill was actually freedom from authoritarian manipulation. Good point, Matthew. Yes, people manipulated into supporting an authoritarian. They don't feel like it's an authoritarian because they're like, no, authoritarian is force. And I gladly embrace Trump, who you accuse of being an authoritarian. There's nothing forcible about it. I submit out of love to his supreme goodness. Yes, that's the trouble with fascist leaders. They also create and are created by fascist supporters. Whew, scrolled too quickly, okay. So the Minutemen were fueled by the usual mix of paranoid conspiracy theories and visceral ethnic loathing of Latinos, and eventually crumbled into a pathetic but legal circus of criminality and epic Coen brother-esque bizarro tragedy. There's a link. The movement was also clearly activated a strand of white supremacist activism that had not made itself public for many years. So this was taken at a California anti-immigrant rally in 2006. That is a good reminder that this did not come into being with Trump. Trump has exacerbated this, but look, here it is in 2006, people flying the Confederate flag, the Nazi flag, and the American flag. So those people have always been there. White America, in part, may have been complacent that because they were contained politically, they weren't a problem. Or at least they weren't a problem that we had to organize to do anything about, or that we even necessarily could organize to do anything about. But I think more of us are interested now in organizing in a way to build a coalition of the decent, so that we're not just hoping that they stay contained in their little racist circles, but that we're actively sharing information with each other to make the rhetoric of decency and stability and prosperity and kindness a strong, much talked about rhetoric, and not just an assumed rhetoric. We're here to make explicit the opposite of fascism. Liberalism. Oh yeah, that's the word for it, isn't it? Liberalism. We're here to rehabilitate the word liberalism from the efforts to smear and disparage it. Civilized society. Civility. Barack Obama's presidential candidacy seemed to open the door for mainstream conservatism to become host to extremist ideas. It also inspired an immediate violent backlash embodied by Jim David Atkinson's 2008 attack on a liberal church. During the Obama years, all these strands came together under the yellow Gadsden banner, previously a patriot militia symbol of the Tea Party, which became a conduit for far-right extremism and its attendant eliminationism. Obama was subject to a number of smears and paranoid conspiracy theories at the hands of the far right and Fox News during his tenure. The most oddly enduring of these was the birther theories about his Hawaiian birth certificate, which was patently baseless and racist. I'm glad he said the word baseless first. I mean, the word racist often doesn't communicate that things are, we call them racist because they're irrational. Like, it is possible to look at someone else's culture and say, or that culture or that rhetoric is not good right now. That type of extremism is disproportionately located in that country, and we should watch out for that. So that's not racism, that's looking out for threats. And Democrats are often seen as weak because we avoid focusing on a nation as being the location of a threat, because we're against racism. But what we need to be clear about is racism is threat perception logic that has veered off the borders of rationality. It is irrational threat amplification that hurts rather than helps. The white supremacist dogma that comes out of American sources has led to massacres like the Christchurch massacre, and white supremacist terrorism is not only contained within American borders. Absolutely. So yes, the birth certificate hoax, the birther conspiracy hoax. Something came out about that recently because Obama published his memoirs and said, even as they were planning to take down Osama bin Laden, the media was still giving so much airtime to the birther conspiracies, the birther democratic undermining of the elected president, which was led by Trump as the highest profile celebrity to endorse that particular craziness. And Fox definitely was a chief promulgator of those conspiracies, those lies. Let's be honest here, lies. And Barack Obama was quite critical of Fox News, and people took that as an attack on the media. So I hope that retrospectively people go back and say that was fair. Fox News was not functioning as a media outlet. Fox News was not functioning as part of the fourth estate built to hold power to account. It was functioning as a propaganda outlet to undemocratically undermine an elected president. And I hope we call out people like Jake Tapper for that, because Jake Tapper's like, oh, I'm going to side with the media and Fox News and my colleagues. I think now that Fox is is departing from reality in a way that's very evidently endangering the lives of Americans, is actively killing Americans, is complicit in the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans through the disinformation that it's promoted about COVID-19 and hoax cures not hoax cures, I don't need air quotes for that, cures like hydroxychloroquine, and pretending it's overblown and that people don't have to wear masks and that mask wearing is in fact authoritarian imposition. All of the various nonsense promulgated by Fox News hosts. Fox should have been held accountable long ago for its dissemination of anti-democratic lies. Beyond the racism, there was always an undercurrent of eliminationism to the delegitimization underlying the whole enterprise. It made Obama into the other, not a patriot and not patriot and alien. Patriot protesters outside the White House demanded his hanging. Wow. It's supposed to be the fourth pillar of democracy, yes. But, and yes, Trump was also trying to use a form of birtherism against Kamala Harris. But Fox and conservative media, I think, should be held accountable for what they have done to Americans during this pandemic. Shall we hear Trump? Just for a minute.
A lot has been made over the birth certificate issue. And you have said in previous interviews that you have a team of investigators in Hawaii now looking into
blah, blah. There you go. I'm glad I didn't listen to Trump. Trump also declared himself the leader of the Tea Party. Over time, that's what he became. Yes, the Tea Party ate the Republican Party because they already had a lot in common. This thread that I'm reading us through is 75 tweets long, and we're only up to 59. And I have to go soonish, and Alan has to get some sleep. I think there's on screen there looks like it's a quote from Trump about Nancy Pelosi. I want her to do great, and I want this country to be great. And I didn't want her to fail as speaker, and I like her. Well, there you go. In the meantime, the far right kept escalating its hatred of immigrants by reviving Minutemen vigilante groups on the southern border. Militia and patriot militia gangs became increasingly involved in conspiracy-fueled resistance to Muslims and refugee programs. Huh? Shall we listen? I guess we can for a second.
October 9th and 10th, a global protest for...
I love not listening to them, just listening to them for a little bit and then going, yep, cultists, no attention today for you. That was the environment in which Trump announced his candidacy in 2015 and immediately set an overtly eliminationist tone. We've been dealing with his
has become a
BS in the public sphere now for a long time, since June 2015. That's 5 years of this. Whew. I'm not listening to Trump's speech announcing his candidacy and denigrating migrants. This same type of eliminationist rhetoric was directed at Muslim immigrants generally, as he talked about imposing a ban on immigration from Muslim nations. He also indulged harsh rhetoric against refugees, warning that he intended to send them back. There was an unstated eliminationist element to Trump's demand to imprison Hillary Clinton. Yep. The apotheosis of Trump's eliminationist rhetoric, however, was his regular reading of the poem The Snake, which depicts a silly woman who revives a dying viper only to be bitten by it. A classic depiction of humans as toxic vermin. Yes, and like Jesus, Trump understands the power of parables over human attention. So not everybody wants to listen to long political explanations of things, but you can enhance people's adoption of fascist authoritarian rhetoric by making them feel heard. If they have these tribalistic resentments or suspicions of other people, when you publicly tell over and over again a poem describing a snake, i.e. migrant populations, that you pick up to save them, i.e. have asylum-seeking programs where you accept asylum seekers, but then the snake bites you, i.e. a migrant person might commit a crime, and then the snake will say, haha, you silly woman, you knew I was a snake when you took me in. That's the crux of that snake poem. And people familiar with the history of the Holocaust will know that Hitler published a weekly list of crimes committed by Jewish people on purpose to enhance community appetite for oppression and persecution of Jews, escalating oppression and persecution of Jews. But yes, parables are important to increase community hatred, community levels of hatred. I'm not suggesting that Americans uniformly embrace Trump. He's been a historically unpopular president for his entire reign, and hopefully once he's gone, that will increase public appetite. I think it is increasing public appetite for eliminating the Electoral College, because it's more evident now how many Americans have died as a consequence of facilitating the rise to power of the worst of the American psyche. The worst of irrationally racist anti-migrant people who claim to be just really strong and good at attacking America's enemies, but actually use that aggression as a cover story whilst they behave in a very self-serving way and against the interests of the American people, more broadly speaking. So white Americans who vote for Trump because they think he's so good at keeping out Muslims and undocumented migrants are powerfully motivated to overlook the fact that Trump has ushered in death, and that white people have been the collateral damage of that death because they've been more focused on the harms done to others by Trump, the harms done to their enemies. They are drunk on, they're intoxicated by the sense of shared omnipotence. A psychiatrist gave me that term once, who was a guest on the show. He said that's what happens when people follow fascists. They get a feeling of shared omnipotence meaning all powerfulness. They feel like they're part of Trump's ability to overturn norms and achieve anything he wants, to abandon considerations of humanity, to say, no, I can call a snake a snake. Muslims, migrants, they're all snakes. We don't have to pick them up and take care of them. They'll just bite us. They'll take our jobs. Statistics show that the strongest votes for Trump were in counties around America that had the highest rates of premature deaths of despair. Deaths of despair being a sociological term for people who commit suicide, who overdose on drugs, who die from cirrhosis of the liver or obesity, etc., those deaths of despair were highest amongst white working class people in various counties that also had very high rates of voting for Trump. So depressed, non-college educated white people have cheered themselves up by voting for a man who made them feel excited and powerful, and no longer dealing with a worldview from Fox and from conservative radio that made them sad, that made them always feel victimized by liberals trying to undermine, to promote secularization in America and undermine their Bibles and take their guns, feeling culturally despised by people who do have college educations and therefore access to better paying jobs, although also lots of debts with compounding interest rates that make life actually quite difficult for a number of years for people with college degrees. It's not hard to imagine Trump's actions with 4 more years. Yes. Fascism fails once cracks of decent people. Oh my gosh. Trump is to blame for inaction on the virus. I know I sometimes swear I'm not going to pay attention to this dude, but really, he wants it so bad. Sometimes it's just cruel to leave him swinging like that. All right. It's an important point. Trump is to blame for inaction on the virus. Trump is to blame for lying to Americans about the severity of the virus. He's on record. His voice is on audio recordings talking to Bob Woodward on the 7th of February, saying it's a very contagious disease and it's airborne. It's not spread by touch, or it's not just spread by touch. It's an airborne disease, 5 times more lethal than the flu. And that's just what Trump said to Woodward on the 7th of February. So he knew, but he didn't want the stock market to fall because that's a plank of his claim to competence. His claim that he really needs to stand because evidence exists otherwise. There is a manufacturing recession documented in October 2019 and discussed as being a product of his manufacturing wars that he instigated with American trading partners. So Trump is to blame for viral spread because he left New York, he left other states unprotected because he didn't tell American governors what he knew, nor did he launch federal programs or federal strategies to protect Americans from a virus, to reduce the spread, to increase the availability of protective equipment to doctors, and doctors without protective equipment dealing with sick people, particularly people who may asymptomatically carry the virus, who may go to a hospital to be treated for one thing but carry COVID, doctors who don't have access to adequate tests or who aren't dressed in adequate levels of protective gear, protectively to preempt contamination, can be vectors for further disease transmission. Everybody who's lost people in New York, and many people have lost multiple friends, understand that the federal government could and should have done more. There's also a very vast documented history of Trump's racism, from being convicted of discriminating against potential tenants because they were Black, together with his father, marking the rental applications for his properties. Staffers were instructed to use a C to mark the applications of Black Americans in order to disregard their rental applications. And then as penance, Trump and his father were ordered to publish ads in various newspapers in different communities advertising their properties for lease. That was part of the settlement. So no, there's a long established history of Trump racism, but again, indulging trolls sometimes encourages them. I'm sorry, Dwight. It's very sweet of you to promise that if Trump is racist, you will dislike him. I'm thinking now, are you almost an algorithm, or are you just like really, really stuck emotionally? Really stuck in a little loop of just pushing out these fake claims over and over again. Just, sweetheart, I don't believe that you're college educated. You can't spell hypocrisy. You can't spell periscope. It's just not true that you have a college education. It's not. I mean, people neurodiverse people do attend university. I don't want to say that, but you have no interest in spelling things correctly, and you have no interest in history. All you've been interested in for over an hour now is disrupting the broadcast. So no. Matthew's going to miss his parents for Thanksgiving, but you'll be looking forward to hopefully several more decades of having them in your life. That's true. I'm glad you mentioned decades, because the average amount of life expectancy lost by someone who falls victim to coronavirus is 13 years. That's an important point, Alan. The NRA has likely been hiding the enormous numbers of suicides by gun owners. Republicans have opposed legislation to even monitor and keep track of gun violence-related deaths in the United States. Pumpkin, I'm definitely not going to accept your friend request. You're falsely characterizing me as someone who wants to kill babies. I have 2 beautiful children of my own, who I'm going to see soon. And that kind of rhetoric encourages a Holocaust. You're falsely characterizing yourself as a warrior to protect babies while you support people that have caused the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans. So you, sir, are a murderer by association, by your support for and endorsement of murderous disinformation about a pandemic that kills people, about a pandemic that is only stopped at the moment by public action, so modification of behavior. You, sir, are associated with spreading lies that kill and maim and leave people with long-haul disruptions to their health, with financially ruinous medical bills. You, sir, are associated with all of these harms to America collectively, to the economic downward cycle of ruin that America has been placed into because of the depraved indifference of the president to human life and to American function. He has promoted the spread of COVID in order to better organize voters into Trump voters voting in person on the day of the election without fear of a disease, because he's told them it's not a problem, as opposed to voting by mail, which skews Democratic, because Democrats rationally fear the pandemic and don't believe the propaganda emanating from the highest office in the land. So that division was then intended by Trump to involve the separation of ballots. Mail-in ballots were to be counted later. They were to be purposely delayed by Trump's Postmaster General appointee, Louis DeJoy. You are associated with a man who's trying to overturn democracy in favor of a continued opportunity to kill and harm Americans. So no, I'm not going to accept your friend request, and I condemn you very thoroughly. Yes, he did play lots of golf. Well, that's nice. You're actually going to look something up. I'm pleased. You're saying fascism symbol is sticks. Yes, fascia, wrapped around an arrow, because individual sticks are broken easily. It falls apart if dissent is allowed, which is why Republicans are petrified of speaking out. That's cute. He's got an excuse. It's gendered. Spelling is gendered. Oh, thank you. Good content. I appreciate it. Yes, there are many sociopaths on YouTube. YouTube, which isn't a coincidence, YouTube cultivates that by directing people down a wormhole. Criminal negligence is a form of genocide that has killed lots of Native Americans, lots of Black Americans, and also white Americans. Trump supporters are dying in hospital with their last breaths being angry recriminations against the health professionals that are trying to help them, saying, no, I don't need to make a final call to my friends and family. I'm fine. COVID is a hoax. Why are you wearing all of that gear? Multiple nurses have said that that is the sad thing, that thing is happening. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Phil. Yes, it's not just shouting fire in a crowded theatre. It's trying to stop people from leaving a theatre that's on fire and claiming that the smoke is a lie. That's such a powerful analogy, Matthew. I'm going to write that down. Also have to go. Thank you, Maestro. I didn't know you were there. Lovely to see you. Dr. Cat. Thank you, Luke. That's an encouragement I'm going to take a photo of just to remember today and how I had to deal with that dude. I do keep everybody's encouraging comments and I put them in an album. Sometimes I show them to my husband to say, look at your wife doing good work. You can't comprehend the fear you'd have had to not be in the delivery room when your child was born. And that's a reality for many new parents right now. That moment has been stolen. That's so important. And I'm really glad you're using that language of theft as well, because so much theft is occurring. Cheers, you're a maestro. All the best, everybody. I hope to speak to you soon. I'm glad you've enjoyed today's broadcast. There's still more of that powerful historical thread to go through. So maybe for next time. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks, Alan. I love you too. I hope you get some good sleep.